Okay, the reading for this week is an essay by the great 20th century poet Hagiwara Sakutarō, who was an essayist, a poet, a writer of short stories. This essay is called Nihon no kaiki, translated here by me as Return to Japan, published in December 1937. It's a very famous essay because it sort of captures the zeitgeist or the mood of the era, namely the sort of revolt against the West, the turn against the West, and the turn inward. But it's done in a kind of ironic fashion. It says it's impossible for us to return to Japan, but nevertheless we're going to make the attempt to do so. My translation, I just finished it this morning, so it's a bit rough in spots. It's a bit probably too wordy, so I'll probably polish it a bit further before I publish it. I plan to run it in a textbook that should be coming out, a textbook for undergrads about modern Japanese literature that should be coming out from my university press this year or next year, hopefully. The translation I did is based on the version of the essay that's included here in this Chikuma Nihon Bungaku Zenshu, volume 18 of that series. I will put all this information in the description below. I'm going to read the essay now. Also, if anybody wants to run my translation in a journal or a magazine or some online forum or something, send me an email or a direct message on Twitter or whatever, and I will send you the copy of my text. Okay, it's a bit rough, but you should be able to get the gist of what Hagiwara is trying to say in this essay. I will read my English translation. I'll make another video at some point in which I recite the original Japanese version, and I'll make a study guide as well. All right, let me read it now. I'll read it as quickly as possible. Return to Japan, 1937, Hagiwara Sakutarō. Until recently, the West was our home. Like Urashima Taro, who sought his spiritual home in the palace of the Dragon King in the depths of the sea. There's a footnote there. I will provide that in my version, my translation. Like Urashima Taro, you can look it up on your own too. Anything that comes up that you don't know, look it up on Wikipedia. It's all there. Urashima Taro is there. Like Urashima Taro, who sought his spiritual home in the palace of the Dragon King in the depths of the sea, we created this image, this mirage called the West. Today that mirage is gone. With its distant lights forever burning in the sleepless cities and towns, in the multi-layered crystal palace, that mirage was a magic lantern, the lantern called Bunmei Kaika, or Civilization and Enlightenment, that inspired us to sing youthful poems while the carriages rolled in and out of the Rokumeikan. Rokumeikan you can look up too. Those imagined cities and towns have since been realized in the real city of Tokyo, and we are left loitering aimlessly inside its neon signs. The mirage no longer captivates us as it once did. Like Urashima Taro, we have returned home after a long voyage, bearing only a small jewel box as our souvenir. When we opened the lid, we were magically transported 2,000 years into the ancient past of our ancestors, shocked to find that our hairs have grown white. Part 2. Since the Meiji period, Japan has studied Western civilization with an almost superhuman energy, a furious intensity. But our efforts were not internally motivated. Threatened by Admiral Perry's black ships, we had no choice but to protect our isolated island of the East from the white invaders. Shrewdly, we learned that we could resist our enemies by adopting their weapons and technologies. By contrast, the people of China and India succumbed to colonization because they refused to learn from the invading barbarians out of an oriental sense of pride. The Greek-born poet Koizumi Yakumo, aka Lafcadio Hearn, writing some 30 years ago, foresaw a future when Japan would become so adept at all forms of Western civilization, from armaments to industry, that it would rise up against the white man. Awakening from their deluded dream of Occidental worship, the Japanese would return to an ethnic awareness of their native home. Now, in Japan of the Showa period, the Greek poet's prediction has finally been realized. In early Meiji, when the first trains opened between Tokyo and Yokohama, very few ordinary people rode them, despite vigorous government promotion. Most people in those days were afraid to drink cow's milk because they thought it would make them smell like foreigners, and they felt only vague revulsion and dread toward the new conveniences offered by the new enlightened civilization. The Meiji government had to work hard to come up with ways to lead the stubborn, foreign-fearing masses into the new age. Prominent statesmen such as Ito Hirobumi took the initiative by attending the Victorian-style dances held at the Rokumeikan Hall, setting the parameters for the new behavioral norms and showing how veneration of Western civilization represented the correct path forward. How else, they reasoned, could Japan master Western culture except by enthusiastically imitating it? Within the short span of 5 decades, Japan managed to acquire the knowledge of centuries of Western civilization, a miraculous feat that earned the admiration of many. But we must appreciate that the driving motivation behind this miracle was the fever of Western worship, a fever that inspired the dance parties at the Rokumeikan Hall and that swept the whole country into a state of euphoric intoxication. Yet even at the height of this infatuation with all things Western, Japan never lost its ethnic or racial consciousness, as shown by its ability to repeal unjust extraterritorial laws, to revise unequal treaty relationships, and to censure disloyalty in occupied Korea. As Koizumi Yakumo had observed, Japan's Occident worship was grounded in a desire not to conform or subordinate itself to the West, but rather to oppose the West and to fight it. By 1895, Japan had defeated China. A decade later, it had defeated Russia. Today, it effectively stands among the great powers, the great Western powers. Whatever we learned ourselves, and this is true especially with regard to military matters and national defense. Thus, we slowly began the process of awakening from our long infatuation with the West and to reflect on our own culture. In other words, our 70-year national crisis came to an end the very moment we liberated ourselves from our long voyage, and we at last found a way to return to our true spiritual home. Still, we avoided our true home for much too long. We stayed away from our true home for much too long. By the time we had returned, we were shocked to find that no traces of former days remained. The eaves on the houses were decayed and rotted. The gardens had grown wild. Not a single memento of what is essentially Japanese remained. We had lost everything. Searching our memories, we resemble a band of sad troubadours, poetic wanderers, hyohakusha, aimlessly roaming all corners of the wasted land in search of some leftover scrap of something essentially Japanese. Previously, when we sketched down our visions of the West and dreamed of utopias beyond the sea, our hearts would fill with hope and youthful enthusiasm. Now, however, we have lost everything. Yet we can't deny that we are still the same Japanese of the past, and that within our veins still pulsates the 2 millennia-year history of our ancestors. To that extent, we have not lost a single thing. But having searched every corner of the earth, we have at last come to the realization that our only true home, dwelling place, is Japan, this land of our forefathers. Today, however, we find in this country only the discredited image of the West. Noisy steam trains, high-speed electric trams, and tacky buildings erected over every inch of space, each nothing but a clumsy replica of a Western model. We are the same, but we have lost everything. I once wrote about this predicament in a lyric poem. I have not lost a single thing, and yet I have lost everything. 我は何者を喪失せず、また一切を失い尽くせり. Today, the only kind of song we poets can authentically sing from the empty void of our ruined culture is the song of the nihilistic wanderer, set to rhythms of a single antinomy, or aporetic contradiction. A is not A is not A. A は A にあらず, A は A にあらず. In the Japan of today, this dialectical formula lives on as the rhythmical lyricism that pervades the everyday emotions of the poet. Part 3. Having passed through the Western intellect, we have now returned to our pursuit of the essential or original things of Japan. How cold and sad were the long days of our grand tour. Our journey was so unpleasant and unfulfilling because Western intelligence never really took root in the fudo, the wind and soil, the cultural climate of this country, whether for the masses or for the literati. We intellectuals were treated as heretics. We lived our lives as étrangers, internal refugees. But oddly enough, it is this same group of heretics and étrangers that now forms the group of writers who turn their critiques and concerns toward the things of Japan. Certain people of superficial opinions look at this phenomenon, this apparent reversal, and describe it as the defeat of the intellectuals, proclaiming it a cowardly retreat in our struggle. But we have not once retreated. On the contrary, we have struck out at the enemy's siege, attacking recklessly. When we finally succeeded in breaking away, we found ourselves standing in a vast open field, the empty plain of nothingness. In this boundless space of nothing, there were no meaningful images, pictures, or representations of any kind. Only clouds and sky, our own shadows on the ground, and a starved, forlorn feeling of isolation. Is the Western intellect facing imminent defeat in this country? On its last day, will we be left alone to collide against the great emptiness of nihilism? I don't think so. On the contrary, we will stomp mercilessly upon the empty void of nihilism. But ironically, we can only do this with the help of Western intelligence. For it is Western intelligence alone that allows us to intuit or discern our present mission, namely the construction of the new Japan. Those bands of youthful Meiji poets and romantic Meiji politicians who wandered the brick streets of the Ginza of modern Tokyo while dreaming under its pale bluish-white gas lamps, their dreams in actuality amounted to no more than a single idea, the idea of the acquisition of the knowledge of Western intelligence. This single idea served as the founding seed, the esprit, that animated everything in the Meiji period, from the redolent sounds of the new aesthetic to the new life forms that signaled Japan's emergence into the modern world. In classical times, we learned various abstract linguistic systems from China. We learned how to conceptualize, how to make abstractions out of concrete things. We used that Sinitic or continental intelligence to absorb the mighty culture of the eternal and unmatched Tang dynasty. Then we used Tang dynasty as the springboard for creating the great art of the Hakuho and Tempyo periods, and the majestic lyric period poetry of the Asuka and Nara periods. Now, in similar vein, we mobilize another alien intelligence, this time that of the West, in order to restore Japan's lost youth and to show the world how determined we are to forge a new national ethnic culture that will supersede the mighty Tang dynasty. Today, reality is nothing but an empty void, kyomu, as we say. In the Japan of today, there is only nihilism, only emptiness. Our entire culture has been lost, sacrificed, forfeited, and yet our intellectuals, struggling against that nihilism, have at last begun to crawl out from their past delusions and dreams and to move toward the construction of a new future. We are der Will der Absolutisten, the will of the absolutists, will that seeks the absolute. And even as we brood and suffer and grieve, despairing at our losses and disappointments, we shall never surrender this will to move forward. In the past, we were lonely because we were intellectuals. We were étrangers because we were Western. And today, turning our critiques and concerns to the country of our forefathers, we face a most serious and irredeemable dilemma, an insoluble aporia that has only doubled our anxiety. Alienation and desolation, this is the inescapable destiny that eternally awaits every intellectual born in this country. So let us return then to the essential things of Japan. For us poets, this exaltation signifies none other than the creation of sad songs of homeless drifters, the helpless songs of lost souls. Find a troubadour poet and bid him compose a poem to accompany the bugle's gallant victory songs played for the advancing army. May his voice grow louder still, issuing forth commands to the tune of Japanese national purity. Let him command us to leave our quiet, safe places of shelter